Today we're going to take a look at 4 of my favorite, most used, and most unique vintage lenses in my entire collection. So whether you're looking at buying your first ever vintage lens, or if you just want to add something to your collection, there's definitely going to be a great option for you in this lineup. Now, like always, I don't want to waste your time. I'm going to jump right into this video, but if it does help you out and if you enjoyed this video, please consider dropping a like and subscribing to my channel. Now let's jump right into it. Right here I have the Canon FD 70-210mm f4. And so this is of course a Canon lens with the FD mount, which is a couple generations old at this point, which makes sense because this lens started production in 1980. So this lens is over 40 years old at this point, so definitely a full-on vintage lens. There's no autofocus, there's no electronics in this lens. And this particular lens was actually my dad's lens that he used on his older Canon A1 and Canon AE1 film cameras back in the day that he handed down to me, and now I use this all the time on all my digital cameras. In particular, I use this for professional video work on my Sony a7S III. So even though this lens is over 40 years old at this point, this is probably my most used vintage lens in my entire collection. And now I don't only use this lens to get that vintage look and just for fun. I use this lens just because of how versatile and just how sharp and great this is for being such an old lens like this. This is actually the only telephoto 70-200-ish lens that I have on my Sony a7S III, which I use for all my professional paid video production, my YouTube videos, and pretty much everything else. So this lens is legitimately a good enough all-around lens that I use it as my only telephoto lens on my a7S III. Now part of that has to do with the fact that I don't need telephoto lenses super often, and a Sony 70-200mm lens is going to be north of $1,000. And this one was handed down to me for free. To be honest, that's the main reason why I use this, but I've legitimately used this on paid video shoots and the results have been awesome. This is a very sharp lens. It doesn't have a crazy amount of vintage characteristics, which of course, you kind of would normally buy vintage lenses for the vintage characteristics. And I'm not going to say this doesn't have any, but this is just a solid, all-around great telephoto lens. And so at f4, you get a very sharp look. There's really no need to stop this down to sharpen it up or to, increase contrast or anything like that. Wide open at f4, it's sharp, it's detailed, there's not much vignetting or anything like that. It's just a really, really clean, great looking lens. And now it does have a little bit of that vintage creaminess to it that, you really can't explain. You just kind of notice it when you look at videos or photos shot on vintage lenses. But especially if you stop down to like f5.6, this can get away with being just a really clean telephoto lens. For about 50 bucks is what you can pick this up for used. And sometimes it's a little bit more expensive, but for about $50, you can pick up this lens. It's a 70-200 f4. Not the fastest aperture in the world, but a constant f4 is still a great aperture. It's pretty small and light, like you can see. It's versatile. It's built very well. It's really solid. It's made out of metal. And like I said, I've legitimately used this for paid video work for years now, and it has worked great for me. So for 50 bucks for this lens, there's really no downsides to it at that price point. There are a couple things to mention though. First of all, it is a push-pull zoom. So I'm zooming this in and out right now just by pushing it, not rotating it like a normal zoom lens would be. Now this was really popular on a lot of vintage lenses. I'm guessing it was just cheaper, or maybe that was just the first way, manufacturers found out how to design zoom lenses. But basically to zoom from 70-210mm, you just move this ring up and down just like that. And then to focus it, you turn it left and right. And you can see it kind of does extend a little bit while focusing. And also the front element does rotate when you're focusing as well. So if you have something like a polarizing filter on here, it's gonna rotate along with the focusing, which is a little bit annoying. Now also the push-pull zoom, I really wish I had 2 different rings, one to spin for zoom and one to spin for focusing. But honestly, for run and gun work, which again is what I use this most of the time for, run and gun video work on my Sony a7S III, having the zoom and the focus on one ring here where you can zoom and focus at the same time just by pushing it in and out while turning it. Once you get used to it, it makes this a really good lens for run and gun work. Again, that's once you get used to that. It's really weird to get used to at first, and it's even weirder to go back and forth between this and then just a standard zoom lens. But after you get the hang of this focus and zoom mechanism, this is really an awesome lens for run and gun work, being able to just use one hand to zoom and focus at the exact same time. But that, along with the rotating front element, are pretty much the only two downsides I can think of with this lens. again, for 50 bucks, you really cannot go wrong. This is a sharp, clean, great looking vintage lens. It gives you that 70 to 200 focal length for, you know, a fraction of the price of a Sony or newer Canon one would be. And the last thing I actually forgot to mention, this has a whole macro mode in it. So if you're zoomed all the way out to 70 millimeters and you turn this to the closest focus distance and then go even farther, it enters this macro mode where you can get some really crazy macro photos and videos with this lens, which just adds even more to the versatility. I've used this for tons of B-roll for YouTube videos to get that really close-up macro look on products and things like that. And overall, for 50 bucks, you pretty much cannot beat this lens, and I would highly recommend checking it out. Right here we got the Tokina 28-70 f2.6 to f2.8. So this is another very standard zoom lens. A 28-70 or 24-70 is a really common focal length. But of course, this is another vintage lens that's gonna have some special vintage characteristics. This one definitely pushes it to an extreme, even though this is barely classified as a vintage lens. So this was actually produced in the mid-1990s. And this lens has autofocus on some cameras. I wouldn't really recommend using it, but it does technically have autofocus built in. So this lens is really right on the edge of the vintage to modern lens debate, but I would definitely still call this a vintage lens. And this is my favorite standard zoom vintage lens that I own because of just the awesome characteristics and the awesome look it gives you in video. Like I said, this is the Tokina 28-70 millimeter lens. So this is from Tokina, not from, you know, a standard camera manufacturer like Canon or Sony or Nikon, which means you can actually get this in multiple different lens mounts. So I believe you can get this in the Nikon F mount, Canon EF mount, and then I believe a couple other lens mounts that aren't as common, but the Canon EF and Nikon F mount are gonna be the two most common ones that you're gonna find. And mine in particular is the Nikon F mount, but I have it adapted to a Canon mount with just this simple adapter. And so being a 28-70 millimeter lens, this is a very standard but very versatile focal length. Like I said, 24 or 28-70 millimeter lenses are ultra common in, you know, any newer mirrorless cameras, DSLRs, as well as all the older vintage cameras. You can really get anywhere from that somewhat wide 28 millimeter focal length all the way down to, you know, 50 and 70 millimeters to get that portrait stuff. And being an f2.6 to f2.8 aperture, you're gonna get a lot of that background separation as well. So the first thing you notice when you pick this lens up is it is very dense and heavy. This is a very solidly built lens. Very big glass element up front there. And also you can see when you zoom and focus, this is a fully internal zooming and focusing lens. So it's not gonna extend at all when you're focusing and zooming, which makes this a great option for video work, for putting on a gimbal and things like that. And I think this is a great option if you're looking for a vintage lens to record video and cinema work that you want that really extreme vintage characteristic with, you know, a lot of flaring. You want that soft, almost like a black pro mist filter, you know, look straight out of the lens. You're definitely gonna get that with this Tokina 28-70 f2.6. Now, I haven't personally used this much for photography, and I would definitely recommend this more as a video or a cinema lens, but wide open at f2.6, you're gonna get an extremely soft vintage look. And to be honest, at f2.6 wide open in this lens, it's almost too soft. You know, if you're recording in 4K, it just hits that point where it looks really good, like, you know, a good vintage lens, really cinematic, but wide open, it has such low contrast, it lets in so much flaring, and it's so soft that, like I said, it's right on the edge of usable. However, once you stop down to f4, it's gonna add a bunch more contrast, it's gonna get rid of that flaring a little bit, and it really transforms this lens into almost like a totally different lens. And so if you want a lens that you're gonna be able to use for pretty much anything, kind of like the Canon FD 70-210, where it has a little vintage look, but you can still use it for pretty much anything, this really isn't the lens for you. This has very extreme vintage characteristics. And I really just wouldn't recommend this for, you know, standard, like crisp, clean video work. You really want this for, you know, cinematic, for really pushing towards that extreme look, whether it's like a film or a music video or something like that. That's where this lens will really shine. And now also finding this lens is gonna be a little bit tricky. This is a very rare lens. And usually if you look on something like KEH or eBay, there's gonna be, you know, one or two maybe for sale at any given time. The prices also range quite a bit, but that's all kind of for a reason. This lens has a really interesting background that I went a lot more in depth on in a video I'll link down in the description. But this does have some connections with legendary cinema lenses, and that's one of the reasons a lot of people, including myself, love using this for video work and stuff like that. But again, check out the other video if you want to see, more in depth on the reasoning why this is such a rare lens and kind of expensive. But for pricing with this lens, you can typically find it for right around $200 to $300 used. But really just depending on what's available, it's really going to vary. The condition will vary, the lens mounts will vary a lot. And again, it's just kind of a tricky lens to find. But if you do find a good clean copy of this for around, $200 to $300, and you want a lens with that extreme vintage characteristic for video work, the Tokina 28-70 f2.6 to f2.8 is an awesome option. All right, this is the Zeiss Biotar 58mm f2, as well as the Helios 44-2. These are pretty much the same lenses, the Helios 44-2 being a copy of the original Zeiss Jenna. But again, they're pretty much the same lenses. Whichever one you get will pretty much give you the same output. So that's kind of why I have both of them included here. So the Zeiss Biotar 58mm f2 lens was produced between the 1930s and the 1960s. So this is an extremely old lens. Some copies are getting close to being 100 years old at this point, which is crazy. And it's definitely going to make sense because this is the most wild, vintage looking characteristic lens on this list. This is an awesome lens, one of the most fun lenses to use and the most fun looking output, but it definitely has a very specialized look to it, which I'm sure you'll see in just a second. And then of course we have the Helios 44-2, which is a direct copy of the Zeiss lens. This was produced between the 1960s and the 1990s. And like I said, this is literally a direct copy of the Zeiss lens, and they're both pretty much gonna have the exact same look, the exact output, and all your pictures and videos and everything are pretty much gonna look the same with both of these lenses, give or take a very few minor differences. And like I said, these are the most unique looking vintage lenses. On the outside they look pretty cool, but mostly just in what they can produce. So you're gonna get some crazy background separation with these. Being 58mm f2, you're gonna have that really shallow depth of field, but going even further into that, the bokeh and the out of focus areas on these lenses are gonna be super swirly, especially around the edges and stuff. It's gonna look really crazy and kind of like warped, while still getting a really sharp image on the very center. I wouldn't say it's tack sharp or anything like that, but the combination of a really sharp center with the crazy out of focus warped edges and corners can give you some amazing, like some of the best looking vintage lens photos and videos that you can pretty much get. Now the build quality of these is pretty great as well. They're both made out of metal. They're really dense, but also very tiny lenses, especially in comparison to like the Canon FD lens. They're what is that, 1/3 of the height of, a Canon FD 70 to 210mm. So these are very tiny lenses and, like I said, very specialized use cases. But if there's one vintage lens that I would recommend looking into or picking up, especially if it's your first ever vintage lens and you just want to get that extreme vintage look, or if you just don't have one of these in your vintage lens collection right now, this is definitely the one that I would recommend picking up. You can just get some crazy stylized images and videos out of these. If you want that vintage look to be pushed to the extreme for a music video, for a film, or for portraits or photography, and you need, a 58mm portrait focal length, you just cannot go wrong with a Zeiss 58mm f2 or a Helios 44-2 58mm f2 lens. Now when it comes to pricing, these are also both a little bit different from each other. So the knockoff Helios 44-2, you can pick this up anywhere from like $50 to $150. Typically it's around like $80, $75, $100 for this lens. So about the price that, a new Canon 50mm lens would be pretty much. And then the original Zeiss lens, which, I recommend just because it's the original thing. It's older, maybe it'll have a little bit more of that vintage look just because it's, 10, 20, 30 years older than the Helios 44-2 is. This lens is going to be a little bit more expensive, so depending on the version that you get, it's going to be right around $150 to $200, maybe $250. So right around the $200 versus right around $100 price point. And like I said, either one of these you can't go wrong with. They both give amazing looking photos and videos. Honestly, just some of the most extreme, amazing looking vintage characteristics you can get come from these lenses right here. Right here I have the Canon FD 135mm f2. So this is another Canon FD lens with the Canon FD mount that was released in the early 1980s. So very similar to the FD 70 to 210mm, but this is a fixed 135mm f2, which means this is gonna give you some amazing razor thin depth of field and some awesome looking background separation. You know, being a 135mm lens with an f2 aperture like this is gonna be a perfect portrait focal length, or really just an amazing lens for really separating your foreground from the background, getting that razor thin depth of field. That's what I absolutely love using this lens for. It gives such an amazing look. And once again, this is like a 2-in-1 lens, which I'll get into in just a second. But first of all, the build quality of this lens is awesome. This thing is like a brick. It's very heavy for the size of it. You have that huge front element right there. It also has a built-in lens hood that kind of just slips up and down like that. And the build quality overall is awesome on this lens. It has the Canon FD mount, like I said, so you can adapt this to any mirrorless camera pretty much, whether it's Sony E mount, Leica L mount, Micro Four Thirds, Canon RF. You can pretty much adapt a Canon FD lens to any mirrorless camera mount. And wide open at f2, this is gonna give you an extremely vintage look, a really soft, really flary. Like I said, just extremely vintage look to your photos and videos with this lens, wide open at f2. And honestly, at f2, it's almost too soft to be usable. It's such an extreme vintage look that it's awesome to use for some types of photos, but most of the time I would recommend stopping this down to f2.8, where it's really gonna sharpen up. It's gonna get rid of a little bit of that flaring. A great, sharp portrait 135mm lens is the reason why I love this lens, and really the look this gives at any f-stop is awesome. And if you're looking for a dedicated portrait lens or a longer lens like this, that's going to be really good in low light. It's going to have that great, really shallow depth of field. The Canon FD 135mm f2 is definitely something to look into. However, something to keep in mind that this is somewhat of a rare lens and it's kind of hard to find. Similar to the Tokina 28-70, at any given time there's really only a couple of these available on eBay or on keh.com, or anywhere that you can find vintage lenses. It's going to be a hit or miss if you can find this, as well as the prices you can find this at. I've seen this anywhere from like the 100s to the $800 price point, just because at any given time, there might only be one available at whatever price it's pretty much gonna be at. However, a fair price for this, what I got this at, as well as what I see it at a lot of the times if you just keep looking consistently, is right around $300 to $400 if it's in good condition. If you can pick this up for that, $300 to $400, even in the 200s, this is an awesome lens and I would highly recommend it at that price point. However, I wouldn't recommend paying more than $400, $500, $600 for this lens. I do think not being able to use it all the time wide open at f2 does limit it a little bit, and when you're spending that much money on a lens, you could get a newer lens that's going to be a lot sharper. It's going to maybe still give you vintage characteristics, but not to such an extreme of this to where it's sometimes not super usable wide open. And of course, you can pay whatever you think is fair for this. I honestly wouldn't recommend it if it's up in that higher, above $400 price point. But below that, this is an awesome lens. Like I said, it's pretty much two lenses in one, which I think is a great selling point of this lens, and one of the reasons why I love it as much as I do. But there we go, that wraps this up for my favorite, most used, and most unique vintage lenses in my entire collection. Let me know down in the comments what your favorite vintage lens is, as well as if you own any of these already. But like I said earlier, if this video helped you out and if you enjoyed it, please consider dropping a like and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.